Hello everyone, my name is Dr. Bill Roach. This is another episode of Timeless Dialogues where we discuss issues related to theology, philosophy, apologetics, politics, and so much more. And what we're going to do is we're going to start a series on an evaluation of different arguments for the existence of God. But before we do, we've got a couple things to jump into. And first and foremost, probably of the top priority is a special book announcement. So here we go. It is radio's greatest of all time, Rush Limbaugh with Catherine Adams Limbaugh and David Limbaugh. Right here. What do we see is the great approval there? Rush Limbaugh himself. Now, I will let you know that I think Rush Limbaugh, Rushbo, the mayor of Realville, was the greatest radio announcer of all time. If you disagree with me, I don't care, because I still think that Rush gave more fuel towards patriotism in our country and gave us conservative media outlets really just the teeth that we needed to dive into the issues of our day. So I'm excited about jumping into this book. I think there are so many good things that we can evaluate with it. And as time goes on, I want to bring out a few quotes from it, but in due time. So as I was saying, I want to jump into issues related to arguments for the existence of God. But one of the things that I also want to do is I want us to keep us in tune with really just how crazy our culture can be sometimes and some of the issues that go on within our culture and sort of, spawning from that desire and driving from my love of Rush Limbaugh. We have started this little segment called Realville. And Realville, as we say here, is this notion developed by Rush Limbaugh. He gives us this wonderful quote where he says, "I live in Realville, and my problem is that I'm governed by logic, and some of the claims that are made by people on the left just don't hold up." And this is exactly what Rush taught us to do, was to refute absurdity with absurdity. But sometimes what we need to do is we need to show bold, strong individuals standing up to our leftist, progressivist culture for the sake of truth, using Realville in crazy clown world in order to show the superiority of truth in and of itself. And what I want to do is I want to play this little video that I think really speaks for itself of a pastor in Raleigh, North Carolina. There is a difference between the two. And he's addressing the Wake County School Board on the issue of indoctrinating kids with woke diversity, equity, and inclusion ideology. But before we do that, we need to have this special little promo video here.
Trumpet fanfare update time. Here we go, ladies and gentlemen.
Now, with Rush's approval, we can proceed.
We are failing black students in the name of diversity. In the Jim Crow era, black students were locked out of the public school system. But today they are trapped in. And many of these students need options. They need school choice. They need the opportunity to take their taxpayer dollars and take it to school systems that will benefit them and support them and educate them. And as we talk about inclusion and making sure that the trans student feels comfortable and the queer student feels comfortable, what does that have to do with reading, writing, and arithmetic? As we are teaching cultural Marxism and grooming children to be the next pervert, we are damaging our kids in this public school system, and it needs to stop. While we are failing black students.
And what you can see from this video is that this individual took a bold stand for the fact that what's the point of education? Education is teach us how to actively engage in society. And how do we do that? Through reading, writing, and arithmetic. But all of these diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, or DIE, if we changed a little bit of the order there, what do they give us? They give us really something that is contrary to it. And if you listen to his full speech, what he does is he talks about how our grades are lower right now because we're pushing all of these agendas. In order to make a certain segment of society feel better about themselves, we're excluding the norm of society. So in so many respects, coming back to this notion of realville, if we're driven by facts and logic, we see that the outworking of the leftist worldview falls apart by the simple fact that it doesn't work. They push all of these ideologies and all of these agendas, but they're unlivable. And we're going to look at how this sometimes applies to issues related to moral argumentation. People deny absolutes. They deny that this concept that there is an absolute morality, but yet they live as though there is an absolute morality some of the time. Some of the time they live like pure hedonists, but whenever somebody robs them, hits their car, says something to them, picks a bone with them, how do they respond? As though they're moral absolutists. So with no further ado, let's actually dive into our topic here today. And the topic that we're jumping into is moral argument for the existence of God. And sorry that I had that thing moved up just a little bit. Actually, it looks like we've got a little issue that we need to fix with our PowerPoint here. So give me 1 second as we drag this out. Oops. There we go. We'll let it drive into our other side just a little bit for you today. Sorry about that. So here's the whole thing that we're going to look at. Moral arguments for the existence of God. And in particular, I'm going to give an explanation coming out of the Handbook of Christian Apologetics by Peter Kreeft and Robert Tacelli. So a little background on them. Peter Kreeft and Robert Tacelli are professors at Boston College, or BC as they would say, which does not necessarily stand for Boston College, but barely Catholic. And if you know anything about many of the things of our Jesuit and Catholic institutions today, there's a lot of truth to that. But the point that I'm bringing here is that these two are key individuals who are explaining to us the pertinent issues in the philosophy of religion. They're both incredibly well equipped to address these issues. They have dozens of publications, both in book form, article form, speaking engagements, and so much more. Now, they put out this book called A Handbook of Christian Apologetics. And in the book, they published this in 1994, so it's a little dated, but truth is never dated. If the truth is actually in the book, it is timeless in that regard. And some of the things that they look at, the topics are issues related to faith and reason, arguments for the existence of God, God's nature and attributes, God and grace, and God and glory. In short, the book covers topics related to truth, the existence of God, the problem of evil, the divinity of Christ, the resurrection of Christ, the Bible, life after death, heaven, and hell. And the point that we're bringing out with this is that this is a book put together by two figures who are considered leading scholars in this field. And they bring together a coalition of arguments in all of these different areas to give us a cumulative case for what would be considered the historic Christian faith. And in that, they're giving us things related to the nature of truth as true truth, whether or not there's a God. What do we do with issues related to miracles? Is the Bible reliable? Is Jesus who he claims to be? What about the resurrection? And then issues related to salvation and so much more. Now, one doesn't have to agree with every nuance of their argument to see that there's a lot of value in this book for us today. And one of the reasons that I'm bringing this up is that I think that there are several good arguments found in this book that are not necessarily found in the standard evangelical textbooks that are out there. And I want to reintroduce some of their arguments into the conversations because I think that there's truth value in them. Now, in doing so, I can already hear the objections. In fact, when my PowerPoint was a little messed up before, one of those objections would have been brought up. So why this approach? Like we were saying, first, to explain different approaches and arguments to the existence or for the existence of God. Now, there are many approaches out there that offer scientific proofs, and they're fine, and they're valid, and they're sound, but there are also other types of arguments that we can use that don't require you to have a strong background in biology or cosmology or any of the other ologies in that scientific sense. Second, different arguments may sway different minds. Not all people are scientists or logicians. Not all people require strict scientific proof. Now, granted, we live in a materialistic age. We live in an age that is so-called dominated by the field of science. But not all people think like scientists. Not all people nerd out in the chemistry lab or the biology lab or with computers. there are other people that are swayed, moved in other ways. In many respects, I don't think that that's, denying the truth of argumentation. Rather, it's saying that not all people are moved by the same things. We're really people. We're really individuals. We have different desires and wants and attractions, and those different things can move us in various ways towards truth in and of itself. And in one sense, that's what apologetics is doing. Now, I recognize the sole and full sovereignty of God in salvation, but I realize that that doesn't mean God somehow jettisons means. Now, obviously, faith comes by hearing, and hearing that which is the word of God, but God has used apologetics and will continue to use apologetics because there's a harmony between faith and reason. In addition to this, Kreeft and Tacelli offer a significantly different approach to the moral argument than other classical apologists. Hence, it will bring more exposure to this type of argument. And I think many people are familiar with the argument that comes through William Lane Craig for objective moral values and how that can lead to an argument for the existence of God. Good argument, valid, sound. I don't want to do away with it. I think there's, significant value to it. Or on a little bit more of a popular level, we've seen, Geisler and Turek with their book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. And one of these two branches are usually the most popular that you're seeing today. And I want to give just a different one. So if this interests you, please stick with me. But here's the key objection. I can hear so many people now, but they are Roman Catholics. How can we listen to these dog collar wearing Roman Catholics? Well, first of all, true, they are Roman Catholics. And no one is denying or downplaying the differences between Roman Catholics and Protestants. We realize that there are real differences. We're not trying to, just turn everything gray. I think real Catholics, real Roman Catholics recognize that there are differences within Protestantism. Protestants recognize that there are real differences with Roman Catholicism. We're not doing away with that. We're just not dealing with that at this point in time. Some of you may think that that is horrible. That is somehow disproving everything that we're going to say today. And I would say, make your case for it. Second, it is also true that Roman Catholics can make good arguments for the existence of God. Protestants do not actually have sort of this sole, bastion of arguments for the existence of truth. It's not like it's located solely within Protestantism. In fact, many Roman Catholics are better at giving classical arguments for the existence of God than many Protestants. And it's interesting today because you have varying levels of classical apologetics. In fact, I would disagree with many things within William Lane Craig's minimalist approach to classical apologetics. I don't want to make the target as small as possible. Rather, I want to make the target as fully orthodox as possible. I want to go not only to the mere reliability of the Bible, I want to go to the full inspiration, infallibility, and inerrancy of the Bible. I want to deal with every jot and tittle. In that sense, I'm following within sort of the trajectory of Sproul and Gerstner and other historic, classic, Protestant, Reformed apologists who are trying to give us the fully orbed Christian faith. We just realized we can argue for each step of it. And that differs significantly from people who would consider themselves presuppositional, who don't want to actually give arguments for the existence of God other than transcendental arguments. Now, I have my issues with transcendental reasoning and transcendental arguments for the existence of God. That's a different discussion for a different day. But my point is that sometimes Roman Catholics are better than Protestants at making arguments for the existence of God. Sometimes Protestants are better at making arguments for the existence of God than Roman Catholics. But my point is that just because they're Roman Catholic doesn't somehow disprove the logic. It doesn't disprove the validity and soundness of their arguments in any respect. In addition, to claim that a person cannot make a good argument for the existence of God because he or she is a Roman Catholic is committing a genetic fallacy. We're literally throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Just because something comes from an origin you may disagree with doesn't deny that truth can actually be found there. Just because truths in medicine may come from atheistic scientists doesn't disprove the good and beneficial use of medicine for us today. And just because somebody can find truths for the existence of God within a group of people, maybe Roman Catholic in this sense, that you disagree with them on significant other issues, doesn't disprove the validity of what they're saying here. Even a Roman Catholic can argue that 2 plus 2 equals 4. In addition to this, we evaluate the validity and soundness of arguments, not their religious origin. Now, ideas have consequences and ideas have origins, but we need to test arguments in and of themselves. We need to realize that if the premises are valid and sound, then the conclusion necessarily follows from it. If you don't like the conclusion, you need to question one of the premises. Now, a lot of people are sometimes balking at this. They don't like this approach to it. But again, truth isn't determined by origins. It's determined by logical validity and soundness of premises in arguments. Now, what we have to find is that good arguments are good arguments wherever they are found. Namely, we believe in the unity of truth. All truth is God's truth if the thing is actually true. Now, I want to go and maybe take a little bit of a red herring here, a little rabbit trail onto something else. People will say, well, Bill, what about all this wokeness that you've been critiquing? Well, what have I said? All truth is God's truth if the thing's actually true. And my biggest issue with wokeness is that as a theory in and of itself, it's false. I have not been making the argument it's false because it comes from an atheistic Marxist worldview. That's true. It does come out of an atheistic Marxist worldview, but it's not false just because of that. It's false because it's not a valid and sound argument. It's false because it's denying the universal nature of truth, and it denies the concept of true truth as Schaeffer used to give us. So I'm not being inconsistent. I'm actually being very consistent. If I find something that's true, then I think that is consistent with the Christian worldview. Now, the moral argument that they give, it's a little different than what most people are used to seeing here. So let's just dive right into it. They claim this. Premise 1, real moral obligation is a fact. We are really, truly, objectively obligated to do good and avoid evil. 2, either the atheistic view of reality is correct or the religious one. 3, but the atheistic one is incompatible with there being moral obligation. 4, therefore, the religious view of reality is correct. Now let's break down this argument. Let's understand what they're actually claiming here. Premise 1, real moral obligation is a fact. We are really, truly, objectively obligated to do good and avoid evil. And they give us a few qualifications in their book. They say it does not mean this. It is not claiming we can find people around who claim to have certain duties. Namely, duties don't equal moral obligations, moral facts in that regard. So it's not claiming we're just looking at the concepts of duties in and of themselves, and somehow duties are equivalent to a moral fact. Like, I feel it is my duty to do something, because that could just be an individualized aspect, not something that's binding upon all people at all times and all places. In addition, it does not mean that there have been many people who thought they were obliged to do certain things and to avoid doing other things. So what would be an example? They say we're obliged to do certain things, like clothing the naked or feeding the hungry, or avoiding doing other things like committing adultery. So notice this. They're not trying to say that it's just, a real moral obligation is just something that you personally believe. And it's not saying that it's something that you feel like you just have this generic obligation to do, or something that you're just generically trying to avoid. Rather, these are real obligations for all people at all times and all places. And they're not personal preferences, and you're not just generically avoiding something out of personal preferences. There's something that are moral oughts, they're moral obligations that are real, true, and objective. Something that all of us should do, or it's something of which all of us should avoid. Now, what does it mean? What does premise 1 mean? It is claiming that we human beings really are obligated, that our duties arise from the way things really are, not simply from our desires or subjective disposition. It's not just because your family told you to do something. It's not just because your culture told you to do something. It's not because mommy and daddy told you to do something. It's not because you woke up one day and had a subjective desire to go out and do some good to somebody. Rather, they're saying it's here. It's something that we're really obligated to. It's something that's binding upon all of us. In addition, it is claiming, in other words, that moral values or obligations themselves, and not merely the belief in moral values, are objective facts. So just because you believe in moral values wouldn't make them something that's binding upon all people. The only thing that would make them a true obligation is if it rises above your personal belief about them to actually being an objective, real, moral fact. So this is what they're trying to claim in this first premise. The key of the first premise is to realize that these are real moral obligations, and they're a fact. They're as much of a fact as something that's right before you. They're as much of a fact of any other thing that you would deem as a true fact. It's not a preference. It's not something that just appears unto you. There's something that truly, actually, objectively corresponds to reality and has a moral binding force upon you. In addition to this, premises 2 through 4. Premise 2, either the atheistic view of reality is correct or the religious one. But the atheistic one is incompatible with there being moral obligation. Therefore, the religious view of reality is correct. Now, let's look at a few things related to this because I think it's important for us. The logic of the argument. It's a disjunctive argument, either A or B. And then how do you deal with disjunctive arguments? We must deny one of the conjuncts. It's either not A or not B. So in this sense, either the atheistic view of reality is correct or the religious one. And they deny that the atheistic view is correct. So in this sense, either A or B, not A, therefore B. And the reason is that you do not affirm a conjunct. That is a logical fallacy. When we're doing moral reasoning, we must deny one of the two in an either or conjunct. And that's the flow of the argument that they're giving us here. Notice this. They just have to disprove the one, not necessarily prove the other. So when we look at the fullness of the argument in and of itself, what they're trying to do is that they're granting that there's this moral, objective obligation for all people. And they're saying either the atheistic view of reality is correct or the religious one. But the atheistic view of reality can't be correct because it fundamentally is incompatible with premise 1, which is the notion of moral obligation. So they give us this truism, either A or B, not A, therefore B. That's the logic. That's the flow of the argument that they're giving us here. Now, they start to go on and they give us a little bit more of an explanation so that we can understand what they're truly claiming. Kreeft and Tacelli claim on page 72 of their book, now, given the fact of moral obligation, a question naturally arises. Does the picture of the world presented by atheism accord with this fact? The answer is no. Atheists never tire of telling us that we are the chance products of motion and matter, a motion which is purposeless and blind to every human striving. We should take them at their word and ask, given this picture, in what exactly is the moral good rooted? Moral obligation can hardly be rooted in a material motion blind to purpose. So, does the picture, namely this picture of moral obligation that we've seen presented by atheism, accord with the facts? So, with matter and motion, of which there is no grounding for moral ought, how do we get moral ought from that worldview? You can't. Because what you find with matter and motion is mere chemical reaction, mere purposeless, as it would say here, blind motion, not moral obligation. There's no teleology to the moral obligation that's coming about. And a classic example that's sometimes given by Doug Wilson is he would say something like this. What if I had, say, and I'm just going to pick two nebulous ones, a can of Pepsi and a can of Mountain Dew, and I shake them up and I open the cans and all of a sudden they're exploding because we've shaken them up and we see all of it coming about. Where would a moral obligation come from this? It's just merely one chemical reaction followed by another chemical reaction in the state of affairs. It's chemicals blowing up against other chemicals, falling out on the concrete or whatever floor you have them on. And the point is this, is that we take them at their word, and that given this picture, in what exactly is the moral good rooted? Moral obligation can hardly be rooted in a material motion blind to purpose. So they continue to go on here. They go on to say, well, what about human willing and desire? Suppose we say it is rooted in nothing deeper than human willing and desire. In that case, we have no moral standard against which human desire can be judged. For every desire will spring from the same ultimate source, purposeless, pitiless matter. And what becomes of obligation? According to this view, if I say there's an obligation to feed the hungry, I would be stating a fact about my wants and desires and nothing else. I would be saying that I want the hungry to be fed and that I chose to act on that desire. But this amounts to an admission that neither I nor anyone else is really obliged to feed the hungry. That, in fact, no one has any real obligations at all. Therefore, the atheistic view of reality is not compatible with there being genuine moral obligation. If it's nothing more than willing and desire, then it's nothing more than your personal preferences. You're simply stating a fact about yourself, not stating something that would be binding upon all figures. And that's why they're saying this, to come back to this. For every desire will spring from the same ultimate source. If you're nothing more than matter and motion, if you're nothing more than just a material composite, then even your desires would be purposeless, pitiless matter. And as they go on to say, and what becomes of obligation? According to this view, if I say there's an obligation to feed the hungry, I would be stating a fact about my wants and desires and nothing else. In short, it's not compatible with the notion of moral obligation, because moral obligation is not purposeless, but with actual design. It's with a purpose. It's not pitiless. It's with actual true compassion and mercy. And it's saying that people are more than matter. They're made in the image of God. Therefore, they have value. Now, as we continue to look at this, what view is compatible? They ask this. So which one would it be? We have this fact of moral obligation and this reality of moral obligation, and we have this materialistic worldview, and we have this generically religious worldview. Which one? The atheistic worldview / materialistic worldview or the religious worldview is compatible with the concept of moral ought, this idea of moral obligation. So which one is compatible? One that sees real moral obligation as grounded in its creator, that sees moral obligation rooted in the fact that we have been created with a purpose and for an end. We may call this view, with deliberate generality, the religious view. But however general the view, reflection on the fact of moral obligation does seem to confirm it. So they start to respond to different objections. And the first objection is that the argument has shown that ethical subjectivism is false. What if there are no objective values, one might say? So maybe you're saying, well, subjectivism may be false, but what if there's no actual objective values in and of itself? What if it's just something you're coming up with? Well, they go on to say this. True enough, the argument assumes that there are objective values. It aims to show that believing in them is incompatible with one picture of the world and quite compatible with another. Those two pictures are the atheistic, materialistic one and the, broadly speaking, religious one. Granted, if ethical subjectivism is true, then the argument does not work. However, almost no one is a consistent subjectivist. Going back to the way that you actually live your real life. Think about this. Many think they are, namely they are subjectivists, and say they are, boldly say they are, until they suffer violence or injustice. In that case, they are invariably stand with the rest of us in recognizing that certain things ought never be done. For example, you're standing in a coffee shop and somebody pickpockets your wallet and you go up to pay for your coffee and you realize, man, this guy just took my wallet. It's gone. I can't pay for it. You will become a moral objectivist right then and there. Or let's just say you're out there and you're driving and somebody hits the back end of your car and they speed off. Are you going to be a moral subjectivist and just say, oh, I'm sorry. They just happened to hit my car today. It doesn't really matter. You know, everything's going to be fine in my purposeless, randomless motion and matter worldview. No, you're going to be ticked off. You're going to want to drive after the guy. You're going to be calling the police. You want his insurance to pay, not yours. Now, keep going with this. And for the many who are not and will never be subjectivists, the argument can be most helpful. It can show them that to believe as they do in objective values is inconsistent with what they may also believe about the origin and destiny of the universe. If they move to correct the inconsistency, it will be a move towards the religious view and away from the atheistic one. So let's sort of explain this one a little bit more because there's a lot packed into it. First of all, if moral subjectivism is true, then this whole argument is false. No one lives consistently with moral subjectivism, is their point. So it's not like subjectivism is true. That can be adamantly disregarded because one can claim in theory and proclaim with their mouth subjectivity, but they're not living it with their lives. And a true, robust, fully orbed argument for something that is true. A worldview in that sense must deal with what you claim and what you are holding to in theory, what you're proclaiming with your mouth, and how you're living it with your life. If all of these things aren't coming together, you're living with a grave inconsistency. Now it goes on to say, if you believe in moral absolutes and materialism, you're living with an inconsistent worldview. And here's why. Because materialism cannot account for moral absolutes. So they're granting that there are people in this world who would claim to be a materialist and affirm moral absolutes. But what they're arguing is that there's a great disconnect between these two different claims. Namely, you got rivaling siblings going on here. In one room, one sibling saying, I believe in moral absolutes. In another room, it's saying, but I'm a materialist. Yet, what we've seen is that materialism, as they have already shown, is incompatible with the notion of absolute, purposeful, merciful, compassionate, obligatory absolutes for all people at all times, at all places, that rise above your desires and your personal preferences. So here's what they argue for. The only consistent worldview that can account for moral absolutes is the religious one. Why? The religious one can give you purpose. It can give you mercy. It can give you compassion. It can give you obligation at all times, at all places. It can go above desire, and it can actually change your desires towards that moral absolute. It's actually consistent with it. Objection number 2. This proof does not conclude to God, but to some vague religious view. Isn't this religious view compatible with very much more than traditional theism? Well, their argument is, well, yes, indeed. It is compatible, for example, with Platonic idealism and many other beliefs that Orthodox Christians find terribly deficient. But this general religious view is incompatible with materialism and with any view that banishes value from the ultimate objective nature of things. That is the important point. It seems most reasonable that moral conscience is the voice of God within the soul, because moral values exist only on the level of persons' minds and wills, and it is hard, if not impossible, to conceive of objective moral principles somehow floating around on their own, apart from any persons. So notice this. But we grant that there are many steps to travel from objective moral values to the creator of the universe or the triune God of love. There is a vast intellectual distance between them. But these things are compatible in a way that materialism and belief in objective values are not. To reach a personal creator, you need other arguments, and to reach the God of love, you need revelation. By itself, the argument leaves many options open and eliminates only some. But we are surely well rid of those it does eliminate. So let's look at these two in particular, because I think there's a lot to consider here. You know, we see this idea is that, yes, it is compatible with the notion of Platonic idealism, or just realism in the classic sense of the term. The idea that there is an objective, real world, external from the human mind, that is a true realism. It's a true metaphysical realism. And we also find that within Platonism and Aristotelianism and any of these sort of classic, sort of non-Christian realisms, yes, there are real things that we differ with them on, but it doesn't mean that they were wrong about everything. We find, as they say here, there are things that are terribly deficient within them. So just because there's a similarity in one area doesn't mean that we've bought into everything that that other area is actually teaching. But notice this, as they say here, but this general religious view is incompatible with materialism and with any view that banishes value from the ultimate objective nature of things. So the point that they're trying to get at is yes, there may be some kind of consistency with this idea of Platonic idealism. We could actually say a consistency with Aristotelian realism or moderate realism at this point. And we may find issues within Platonism or Aristotelianism. But the point is this: it's radically incompatible with materialism. And that's the point of the argument. We're not trying to disprove everything. We're trying to just disprove this one thing. So before we start jumping to all these other issues, we need to deal with what the argument's actually trying to deal with. Namely, is a generic religious view true, or is materialism true? And they're showing materialism is false. And that's why they're getting to this whole thing. Well, this isn't the fully orbed God of the Bible in this sense. You're right. It's one argument on one issue. And they're not claiming that you can't get to the full God of classical theism and Trinitarian theism that reveals himself in the Bible and in the person of Jesus Christ, who lived a perfect life, died on the cross, rose again, ascended on high, and so on and so forth. What it's arguing is that we deal with particular arguments as they arise. We don't have to argue about everything in order to argue about one thing. In addition, it's noting that we can offer multiple arguments about multiple issues to build a cumulative case about Christianity. The point is, it's working on the elimination of materialism, not anything else at this point. So, sort of a conclusion. Kreeft and Tacelli are providing an argument from morality to prove that materialistic accounts, which are evolutionary, subjective, and relativistic at best, are faulty. Kreeft and Tacelli provide a different approach to the moral argument, namely a generic religious argument, than other apologists who argue from the existence of objective morals to the existence of an objective moral lawgiver. Now, I think both approaches are fine. Again, like I stated in the very beginning, I'm just giving you more options. I'm dealing with something more than the generic Christian apologist approach that you see on the internet or at your average Christian apologetics conference and so on and so forth. Like I said, the other approaches are valid and sound. They're just different arguments. In short, not all arguments have to be silver bullet arguments that cover every aspect of every issue. Sometimes you further the dialogue by disproving certain positions. In this case, disproving materialism, which is the most dominant worldview of the West. So as we sort of finish here, what I want us to consider is the fact that we are going to go through some of these different sort of oddball arguments with the goal and the purpose of expanding our knowledge as it relates to theology, philosophy, apologetics, politics, and so much more. So what I would encourage you to do is buy Kreeft and Tacelli's book, read through these arguments, and see our evaluation here. Point them on to other people, send them to figures, like and subscribe to the channel as it helps us grow. But ultimately, the goal and the purpose here is to equip the church with truth and to equip them to evaluate truth claims and, as we could always say, to evangelize the lost and defend the historic Christian faith.